Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for braving the cold and ice and general winteriness. Finally arrived. Tonight, when we get started, we're going to be starting 2nd Maccabees. We finished 1st Maccabees last time. And as I talked about when we were first getting into the books of the Maccabees, 1st Maccabees, as we saw, was sort of a broad history of this whole period, running between about 160 BC up to about 80 BC. And 1st Maccabees taking place in Palestine, in what became independent for a time, Judea. 2nd Maccabees is going to take place in the same place at the same time, but it's got a little bit of a different focus. 1st Maccabees was sort of zoomed way out, sort of giving you the broad strokes of history, the battles, the alliances with different kings, the succession of kings, back and forth. battles, yeah. Kings assassinating each other and their brothers coming back and assassinating the assassin, and yeah. So, 2nd Maccabees is in that same period, but it's going to be zoomed in. So it's going to be telling us more particular stories on a closer level with particular people during those big sweeping events. Okay, so for example, we read sort of in general about the persecutions that Antiochus Epiphanes brought down on the Jews to try to get them to stop following God, to stop following their traditions. In 2nd Maccabees, we're going to read the story about a mother and her children who fall victim to that repression. So, same broad stroke story, but on a much closer and more personal level here in 2nd Maccabees, sort of all the way through. And as we're going to read tonight, they explain not far into it that 2nd Maccabees is actually an abbreviation of a 5-volume work that no longer exists, or at least we don't know of any copies of it, that was written, a history of this period, that was sort of a secular history of this period. And 2nd Maccabees is taking material, it tells us, from that history that we no longer have. Okay. When we get to 3rd Maccabees is going to be much more different. 3rd Maccabees takes place in the same period of time, but 3rd Maccabees takes place in Egypt. Because it wasn't just the Greek Syrian governors who were causing trouble. It was also the Egyptian Greek governors were very much on the same page in terms of the way they were treating people who were trying to follow the God of Israel at the time. So before we get started, did anybody have any questions left over they want to ask from last time? Otherwise, we'll go ahead and dig in here. Okay. And when we pick up here at 2nd Maccabees, just for a time period, it starts at about 143 BC. That's about where 2nd Maccabees starts. And it begins with sort of a cover letter. Okay, we're going to see this. This seems a little strange, but we're going to see a lot of this in the New Testament. Okay. Books like this that were written, of course we call them books now, but they were written on scrolls. But these accounts that were composed were usually composed at the behest of someone. So for example, when we get to the Gospel of Luke in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, he compiled those Gospels telling about Jesus and then his apostles in Acts for a man named Theophilus, who would have been a wealthy person who could afford to pay the costs of having it all written down and then copies made by hand, of course, and distributed. So, and the same thing with the book of Revelation. When we get to the book of Revelation here in a few years, right before we're finished with the Bible, there are actually 7 cover letters tacked onto the front of the book of Revelation, because when St. John recorded the revelation he received, he sent it to 7 different churches, and each church he sent it to, he attached a letter to them at the beginning. Okay, so this is normal for works written at this time. This one also has a cover letter that this is being written and being sent to the Jewish community in Egypt. Okay, to tell them, as we just said with 3rd Maccabees, they're suffering and going through similar things to what's going on in Judea. This is being written to them to tell them about what's been happening in the homeland. So chapter 1, verse 1. The Jewish brothers in Jerusalem in the land of Judea, to their Jewish brothers in Egypt, greetings and good peace. May God do good to you, and may He remember His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, His faithful servants. May He give all of you a heart to worship Him and do His will with a strong heart and willing soul. May He open your hearts to His law and His commandments, and may He bring you peace. May He hear your prayers and be reconciled to you, and may He not forsake you in an evil time. We are now praying for you here. Now just the first paragraph there of this cover letter kind of sets a tone. You may notice already it's a very different tone than 1st Maccabees. Right? 1st Maccabees we saw, especially in the latter portions, that increasingly the leadership in what became the independent Judea kind of went into the earthly political realm wholesale. There was not much mention of God at all. There certainly wasn't anything like this coming out of the mouths of Jonathan the high priest or the other leaders toward the end. So this book, as we're going to see, is compiled by faithful, pious people, and it's aimed at faithful, pious people. And we've already got one of the major themes here of the book. There's this idea that they're living in an evil time. Things are bad. Right? Things are bad. But here is what God is doing, and here is some encouragement for you in this evil time that we're all trying to get through together. Verse 7, in the 169th year in the reign of Demetrius, we Jews wrote to you at the culminating point of the affliction that came upon us. In those years from the time Jason and his followers revolted against the Holy Land and the kingdom, and burned the gate and shed innocent blood, we prayed to the Lord, and we were heard. So we offered sacrifice and fine flour, lit the lamps, and set out the loaves. Now then, celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles in the month of Chislev in the 188th year. So this is telling you when this was written. This is after the Feast of Lights. It's after Hanukkah. It's after they've rededicated the temple. Okay, and this is their first time now since they've rededicated the temple that they're getting to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. Verse 10, those in Jerusalem and in Judea and the Senate and Judas, to Aristobulus, who is from the family of the anointed priests and is the teacher of Ptolemy the king, and to the Jews who are in Egypt, greetings and good health. Since we were saved by God from great dangers, we thank Him abundantly as those drawn up in battle order against a king. For He drove out those who fought against the holy city. And when Antiochus, their leader, reached Persia with a force around him that seemed irresistible, they were cut to pieces in the temple of Nenea through a deception employed by the priests of Nenea. For Antiochus, together with his friends, arrived at the temple to marry her for the sake of obtaining most of its treasures as a dowry. When the priests of the temple of Nenea set out the treasures, and Antiochus with a few men had come inside the enclosed wall of the sacred precinct, they closed the temple as soon as he entered it. Then they opened the secret door of the ceiling and threw stones. They struck down the governor and his men, dismembered them, and took their heads and threw them to the people outside. Blessed in every way be our God, who delivered up the ungodly men. So they're kind of celebrating. The Seleucid governor meeting is in. Right? And we talked about Antiochus quite a bit at the beginning, the kind of guy he was, quite a bit in 1st Maccabees, how he had ultimately set up a statue of Zeus in the temple and sacrificed a pig to. Not a nice guy. How he had forbidden the Jews to practice all their ways, tried to force them into Greek paganism. So he was trying to enlarge his territory a little by conquering a city in Persia, and it backfired and he ended up dead. And so the faithful Jews now are happy about that and see that as God bringing justice to him for what he'd done. Verse 18, since on the 25th day of Chislev we will celebrate the purification of the temple, we thought it needful to notify you that you might also celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles and the Feast of the Fire, when Nehemiah, who built the temple and the altar, offered sacrifices. Now this is referring back to, the first obviously is referring to what we now call Hanukkah, right? When they rededicated the temple. The second part they're about to explain. Because the Nehemiah they're talking about is the Nehemiah who wrote the book of Nehemiah. Okay? And we read the book of Nehemiah. It had no mention of what we're about to read. But they're saying, again, remember the goal, they fought this revolution against Antiochus to try to restore things to the way they were. To try to go back to following the Torah, following God's law and his commandments. So they're kind of reminding their brothers in Egypt, here's what's coming up, right, that we should be doing. Okay? And so this Feast of Nehemiah is going to be one of those really minor feasts. But verse 19, for when our fathers were led captive to Persia, the pious priests of that time took some of the fire off the altar and hid it secretly in the hollow of a dry well, where they sealed it so the place would be unknown to anyone. So what that's saying is, at the time that Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed and they were taken away, some of the priests lit something from the fire that was there in the altar of burnt offerings, and they went and hid it. They went and hid it so that they'd be able to eventually, if they came back, relight the altar with that same fire is the idea. Verse 20, but after enough years had passed, when it pleased God, Nehemiah was sent away by the king of Persia, and he appointed the descendants of the priests who hid the fire to get it. When they reported to us that they had not found the fire, but rather a thick liquid, he commanded them to dip it out and bring it. So remember in Nehemiah and Ezra we had all those long genealogies, right, of the priests to show us as the same people. So Nehemiah sends the descendants of those priests, go get the fire to relight the altar from the place where your ancestors hid it. They go there, they don't find the fire, but they find some kind of thick goo, right? They find some kind of pitch. So he has them bring it back. Verse 21, but when the things of the sacrifices were brought to be offered, Nehemiah told the priests to sprinkle the liquid on the wood and the things laid upon it. When this was done and some time had elapsed, and the sun which had been clouded over shone forth, a great fire flared up, causing everyone to marvel. While the sacrifice was being consumed, the priests and everyone offered prayer. Jonathan led, and all the rest responded as did Nehemiah. Okay, so they bring it back, they put it on the altar. Nothing happens at first until the sun comes out, and then it ignites and relights the altar.
This is the same Jonathan in Maccabees?
No, this is a Jonathan living at the time of Nehemiah. So this story they're telling happened back in around 500 BC. Okay. So because in addition to the big feasts that we had set out in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Passover and Pentecost and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the big feast in the Jewish calendar, when things happened, when miraculous things happened, when to commemorate people who were important in their history, these other festivals and remembrances showed up. So Hanukkah, when they rededicate the temple, that becomes another one. This miracle happens with Nehemiah, that becomes another one. And this is why in the church we have the same thing. We have the commemorations on different days of miracles. Today was the recovery of the relics of St. John Chrysostom. Right? As things happened in the life of the church, and to remember important people in the life of the church, we have added in these remembrances. Not to take away from, obviously, things like Pascha, Easter, Nativity, but they remind us of all these things that God has done in history. And so this is the same kind of thing. Okay. So now this is starting in verse 24, this is the prayer that Nehemiah said at the time. The prayer was offered as follows: O Lord, Lord God, creator of all things, fearful, mighty, righteous, and merciful, the only King and good one. You only are bountiful, alone righteous, almighty, and eternal. You save Israel from every evil, and you chose our fathers and sanctified them. Accept this sacrifice on behalf of all your people Israel, and protect your portion and sanctify it. Gather our scattered people, free those enslaved among the Gentiles. Look upon the rejected and despised, and make the Gentiles know that you are our God. Torment the oppressors and those insolent with arrogance. Plant your people in your holy place, as Moses said. Then the priests sang hymns, and when the things of the sacrifice were consumed, Nehemiah ordered that the remaining liquid should be poured out upon large stones. When this was done, a flame flared up, but when a light from the altar shone in turn, the flame went out. Now when this became known, the matter was reported to the king of the Persians. He was told that in the place where the exiled priests had hidden the fire, the liquid had appeared, from which Nehemiah and his men purified the sacrifice. So the king investigated the matter and closed the place and made it sacred. Then the king exchanged many excellent gifts with those he favored. Nehemiah and his men called this Nephthar, which means purification, but by most people it is called Nephthah. Okay. So, why might this really minor incident and feast be important at this time? Well, just like Nehemiah, they've just finished renovating and rebuilding the temple and relaying the altar and preparing for sacrifice. So it's especially important for them to remember the last time this happened, which was back in the days of Nehemiah. And to also remember the people this is being written to also remember when we read the book of Nehemiah, when they were trying to rebuild the temple and they were surrounded, right? When the people had to stand and they had a trowel with one hand, they were trying to rebuild the wall, and the other hand they had a sword because they were having to fight people off. And how even though they were totally outnumbered and things seemed impossible, God was with them, right? That's something important to remember when you're living in an evil time like this. You're being ruled over by Gentiles who want to destroy you, right? Remember the last time. The last time God was with us and protected us. He will this time too. So chapter 2, one finds in the records, as it is noted, that Jeremiah the prophet ordered those migrating to take some of the fire. We're still going back to documentation. This Jeremiah is the Jeremiah who wrote the book of Jeremiah, which we haven't read yet. But he lived at the time in 586 BC when Jerusalem was being destroyed. Okay. Verse 2, the prophet also gave the law to those migrating and commanded them not to forget the Lord's ordinances, nor be led astray in their thoughts when they happen to see the gold and silver statues and their adornment. He also spoke other such words and urged them not to depart from the law in their hearts. It was also written that the prophet received an oracle and ordered that the tabernacle and the ark should accompany him when he went up to the mountain where Moses had gone up and had seen the inheritance of God. So when Jeremiah went there and found a cave, he brought the tabernacle, the ark, and the altar of incense, and then sealed up the entrance. Some who followed him came to mark the way, but they were unable to find it. Now when Jeremiah learned of this, he rebuked them and said, the place shall be unknown until God gathers his people again and shows his mercy. Then the Lord will disclose these things, and the glory of the Lord in the cloud will be seen, as they were shown to Moses, and as Solomon deemed it worthy that the place should be especially consecrated. Now this is interesting because they're trying to explain something here. Right, this is a story about Jeremiah that isn't in the book of Jeremiah. Okay. But as we read, when the tabernacle was first built, right, God's presence entered into it. There was a wind, there was a cloud. Right, there was this consuming fire. Everyone knew the presence of God was there. When Solomon built the temple, God sort of grudgingly agreed to to use it, right? The same kind of thing happened. There was this powerful rushing wind. And God's presence entered in this powerful way. Okay. This little story we just read implies that didn't happen when Nehemiah rebuilt the temple. And that didn't happen when the Maccabees rededicated it either. Okay, because what it's saying is, they're saying there's this story that Jeremiah took all the things that were in the Holy of Holies and hid them somewhere, and said that God's presence wouldn't really come back into the temple until some later day when those things are found. Right? So again, apparently they didn't have the same experience with the temple. And this is why we're going to see when we get into the New Testament that there are a lot of sections of the Jewish community that don't accept Herod's temple as being the temple. Right? That they don't accept that as being a real temple or God's presence really being there, and are going to hold themselves apart from it. Okay? And in fact, Christ is going to speak to that a little, because Christ is going to refer to himself as the temple. Right? When he says, destroy this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days, and they all laugh at him and go, they've spent 40 years building Herod's temple and it's not done yet. We're going to tear it down and you're going to build it in 3 days. Because they didn't get where he's referring to this. He's referring to this idea that, yeah, they rebuilt the building. And yeah, they picked some guy to be high priest. Right? But that doesn't mean God is there. Okay? And that it's in the person of Jesus. Jesus is saying that he comes again. And also, you'll notice the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle, the actual physical tent, the altar of incense, the things that it says Jeremiah took. In the New Testament, when those things are referred to, they're always referred to as being in heaven. In the book of Hebrews, St. Paul talks about the heavenly tabernacle. In the book of Revelation, when St. John goes up into heaven, he sees the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle and these things. The idea, and that is again, the idea being that day that's going to come, when God is going to dwell among his people again, still wasn't there. Again, that temple, or any physical building that someone might build there someday, isn't it. Whether it's the mosque that is there now, whether 10 years from now they tear that down and build something there and call it the temple, it's still not going to be the temple.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
Did they ever find those?
No.
They still haven't found them yet.
No.
The cops say they have.
Well, there's a tradition that we talk about that the Ethiopians have the ark.
Yeah,
But the tabernacle and the other things. So the idea here is that even at the time it was apparent to them that even though they'd rebuilt the temple, they hadn't really reestablished the religion. They hadn't really reestablished the covenant. And Jeremiah himself is going to be the prophet who talks about there being a new covenant that's coming. And so, and of course, Christ to the Samaritan woman says that, pretty soon there's not going to be a temple. Pretty soon there's not going to be one building. Okay. So verse 9, it was also made clear that Solomon in his wisdom offered sacrifice for the consecration and completion of the temple. Just as Moses prayed to the Lord and fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice, so Solomon also prayed, and the fire came down and consumed the whole burnt offerings. Moses said they were consumed because the sin offering had not been eaten. Likewise, Solomon also celebrated for 8 days. So that's following that up. That happened at the temple too. It happened at the tabernacle. It hasn't happened now. The same things are reported in the records and the memoirs of Nehemiah, and also that he founded a library and gathered books about the kings and the prophets and the writings of David, and letters of kings about votive offerings. Likewise, Judas also, that Judas is Judas Maccabees. Judas also collected all the books lost on account of the war that came upon us. So they are in our possession. Thus, if you have need of them, send people to bring them to you. So they're saying to the Jews in Egypt, we've done our best to kind of pull everything together in terms of documents from that time, when they came back from the exile, up till now. We can supplement whatever you don't have. Since then we are about to celebrate the purification, we write to you. Therefore you will do well to celebrate the days. For it is God who saved all his people and gave back the inheritance to all, and the kingdom, the priesthood, and the consecration, as he promised through the law. For we hope in God that he will have mercy upon us soon, and gather us from everywhere under heaven into his holy place. For he delivered us from great evils and has purified the place. See, there you see that ambivalent. God has restored all these things to us, and we look forward to the day when he restores all these things to us. They have this idea that there's something left unfinished here. Verse 19, now the account of Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, the purification of the great temple and the consecration of the altar, and moreover the wars against Antiochus Epiphanes and his son Eupator, and the interventions that came from heaven to those who behaved courageously on behalf of Judaism, who although few in number plundered the whole country and pursued the barbarian multitudes, and received control of the temple famous throughout the world, freed the city and restored the laws that were about to be dissolved, while the Lord with great goodness was merciful to them. All this which was made clear by Jason of Cyrene in 5 books, we shall attempt to abridge into a single book. So this is why we don't have 1st through 7th Maccabees. Because they attempted here to abridge it. Let me this seems like a good place to do it. Because we've already been using the term Jews, and here we see the term Judaism. And it's important that the Greek that comes from this is the word for Jews in Greek. Judaioi, or Judei, means Judeans. Literally, that's what it is. It's Judeans. Okay? And so Judaism means literally the religion of Judea. In this case, the independent Judea that's going to end up becoming Judea, the province of Rome. Okay? And Jew in English is just a shortening of Judean. Okay? So that's where the term comes from. Because it sort of shows up here all of a sudden. We'd either be referred to as Hebrews or Israelites, or this is where Jew comes from, and where the idea of Judaism comes from. It's just identifying the religion with that particular country at this point in history. And so it's a construction, sort of like Hinduism is the same thing. We in the West especially tend to think of Hinduism as if it's a religion like Christianity that has sort of structures and stuff. It really doesn't. Hinduism covers a whole bunch of different types of religion that all happen to be in the Indus River Valley. The Hindi people practice this. And so Hinduism is just the religion that the Hindi people practice. Same thing here. So Judaism literally just means the beliefs or practices of the people who live in Judea. So that's where this is, in terms of the origin, where it's coming from. Then we've just seen the establishment of Judea. So this becomes the term. And so this is the term that's used all through the Gospels. When we have a gospel that's introduced with Jesus said to the Jews who came to him, that means, literally, it just means the people from Judea who came to him. Okay. So verse 24, we're condensing 5 books into one. We realize that a confused mass of material and subject matter makes it too hard on most people who wish to plunge into the narrative of history. Thus we have aimed to help those who wish to read with delight, to make it easy for those who are inclined to memorize, and to appeal to those who read for profit. So we realize none of you want to try to wade through 5 volumes of history, right? So we tried to make it easy to remember, relatable, and to pull out the things that are going to be the most profitable to you. Therefore, for us who have undertaken the difficult task of brevity, this is no easy matter, but one demanding sweat and loss of sleep. As is the case with one who prepares a banquet seeking the benefit of others. All the same, for the sake of the gratitude of many, we will gladly endure the uncomfortable toil, leaving the intricate examination of exact details to the compiler, while devoting our labor to arriving at the outlines of the abridgment.
words, we'll leave the boring part to the
Yeah. Well, yeah. And don't get mad at us for things we left out, because we worked really hard on this. Right? Verse 29, just as the architect of a new house must be concerned with the whole construction, while the one who decorates it and paints it needs to consider only what is suitable for its adornment, so it seems to me is the case with us. It is fitting for the originator of a history to enter into a thorough discussion of words and be inquisitive about every detail, but one who pursues brevity of narrative must be permitted to forego exhaustive treatment. Therefore, from here on, let us begin our narrative, adding only so much to what has already been said, for it is foolish to lengthen the preface of a history, but cut short the history itself. And that's after 2 chapters of preface. 2 chapters of lead. So they're saying, without further ado, because now we're starting to cut into the book itself by rambling on. We're gonna lead into now the actual story. So chapter 3, verse 1, when the holy city was inhabited in complete peace, because the laws were very well observed on account of the godliness of the high priest Onias and his hatred of wickedness. Now let's think back to 1 Maccabees. Was there a time in 1 Maccabees when the city of Jerusalem was inhabited in complete peace? No. Okay. But what's being said here? Why do they say it was in complete peace? Because the high priest, this is one of our rare legitimate high priests, right? Onias, he hated wickedness, and so all the teaching of God was being followed, right? So that's the important connect there. When we were doing things the way we were supposed to, and therefore things were at peace. It happened that the kings themselves honored the place and glorified the temple with very magnificent gifts. Even Seleucus, the king of Asia, provided revenue at his own expense for all the services of the sacrifices. We saw how the Persian emperors had started that. Before that the Persian emperors had paid for the upkeep, with the proviso that when they were offering the sacrifices, that the Jewish people also offer the sacrifices and pray for the emperor. Right? Well, they're saying at first, the Greek rulers did the same thing. At first, the Greek rulers said, help fund the temple as long as they prayed for the Greek ruler, right? And for success, because, they're polytheists. The more gods, the better, right? More gods on their side, the better. So that was a good thing. Verse 4, but a certain Simon from the tribe of Benjamin, who had been made protector of the temple, was at variance with the high priest about the administration of the city market. Thus, when he could not prevail over Onias, he went to Apollonius, son of Tarsus, who at that time was governor of Coele and Phoenicia. And so Apollonius is the Greek governor of Greater Syria and Phoenicia, which is a pretty big chunk of territory. He has a disagreement with the high priest about some money matters, so he decides to go around him and go to the governor. He reported to him the untold wealth in the temple treasury at Jerusalem, so much that the funds could not be counted. Furthermore, they did not belong to the account of the sacrifices, and it was possible they could fall under the authority of the king. Okay, so he says, they've got a lot of money. That high priest, he's sitting on a whole bunch of money there at the temple, right? And it's not, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that's the money that the king is sending for the sacrifices, but no, this is separate money. Which means the king could go in and seize it, right? They're holding out on the king, essentially. When Apollonius met the king, he informed him about the money that was disclosed to him. So the king chose Heliodorus, who was over his affairs, and sent him with orders to remove the aforesaid money. Thus Heliodorus immediately set out on his journey, seemingly to make an inspection of the cities of Coele and Phoenicia, but actually to carry out the king's purpose. When he arrived in Jerusalem and was kindly received by the high priest of the city, he told about the disclosure and why he had come, and inquired whether this was truly the case. The high priest informed him of the deposits belonging to widows and orphans, and also some money of Hyrcanus, the son of Tobias, a man held in very high regard, the value of which totaled 400 talents of silver and 200 of gold. All this was contrary to the report of the ungodly Simon. Okay, so High priest comes out and is honest. He says, well, we've got a fund that we use to help the poor, widows and orphans who don't have anything. And we've got some money that we're basically holding on deposit because they didn't have banks. They're basically holding for this man Hyrcanus, but it's Hyrcanus' money. It's not my money as the high priest. It's not the temple's money. But that's not what our friend Simon had told him. He also told Heliodorus that it was altogether impossible to wrong those who trusted in the holiness of the place and in the dignity and inviolability of the temple honored throughout all the world. But because of the king's orders, Heliodorus said the money must by all means be taken to the king's treasury. So he set a day to go in and direct the inspection of these funds. Okay, so the high priest says to him, and I really need you to trust me on this because you're a Greek and we can't have you walking around in the temple because the temple's holy and you're not. Right? And as you can imagine, that didn't sit real well. So he says, I tell you what, he picks a day, I'm coming and I'm gonna see this money, whether you like it or not. There was no little anguish throughout the whole city. The priests prostrated themselves before the altar in their priestly garments and appealed to heaven, to him who gave the law concerning deposits, to keep them safe for those who deposited them. To see the appearance of the high priest was to be wounded at heart, for his face and the change of his color revealed the anguish in his soul. For alarm and a trembling of body had come upon the man, through which the pain in his heart became evident to those who saw him. People also rushed out of their houses in crowds to make a public supplication, because the place was about to be brought into contempt. Women girded with sackcloth beneath their breasts amassed in the streets. Some of the virgins who were kept inside ran together to the gates, some to the walls, and others peeked out the windows. All stretched out their hands to heaven and made entreaty. There was something pitiable in the prostrations of the entire populace, and in the anxiety and great anguish of the high priest. Okay, so everyone is very upset because this guy's about to go and profane, and they have no doubt in their mind that once he goes there, he's taking the money. It doesn't matter who it actually belongs to. Right? Now we also, something to note here as a side note, these virgins who pop up here. We haven't heard about this before. Yeah, at least it hasn't been mentioned before. But we're told, it keeps referring to the temple as the place. Right? That's out of respect. Now there's reference that there are these virgins in the temple complex. Okay? And this is a reference to what had become a Jewish practice. We talked about how the community of the prophets back in 3rd and 4th Kingdoms or 1st and 2nd Kings, we talked about how there was a community of prophets that lived sort of separately away from the rest of community, and we talked about that in terms of the origins of monasticism. Well, there were also, by this time, women who decided to dedicate themselves. Obviously, you have the priests and the Levites who are serving in the temple officially, but there were also women who chose to dedicate their lives to serving God at the temple, to helping other women. Right? And these women remain virgins, meaning they don't get married, right? And also meaning, obviously, they're not engaging in promiscuity by not being married. But the word that's used is a very specific Greek word, partheni, which refers to this type of dedicated woman. Okay, there are other, in Greek religion, there were certain goddesses that had virgin prophets or virgin oracles, and that's the word that's used. It doesn't just mean a young woman, a woman who's not married yet. It's not what it means. It means one of these women who's specially dedicated to religious service.
How do you
Okay.
pronounce it again, Paul?
Partheni, that's the plural. It's the plural, but yeah. And so, this is the word that's used here to refer to these women who are using in the temple. This is also importantly the word that's used to refer to the Theotokos in the Gospels. When we talk about the virgin birth and her being a virgin, we don't just mean, it doesn't just mean that she was young and wasn't married yet and wasn't promiscuous. It means that she was a woman who had dedicated herself to God. And we, of course, have the feasts in the church of episodes that aren't specifically mentioned in the New Testament, but of when she was brought to the temple as a child and dedicated as one of these virgins. Okay, and so this is important for that reason. If we drop 2 Maccabees out of the Bible, right, then what we could do is we could come in and we can read this as not being a technical term. And we can just say, oh, she was young, she wasn't married, she was a virgin. Right? And we miss a lot of the point of this word being used about her. So, and this is also important when we understand why we talk about her as ever virgin. Okay? We're not just trying to start an argument with Protestants about whether she had sexual relations with Joseph later and had children. That's not the primary focus. The primary focus is the fact that throughout her life, even after giving birth to Jesus, she remained dedicated to serving the Lord through her entire life. Right? Now, as a matter of fact, we say she didn't have other children with St. Joseph, as a matter of historical fact. But that's not the primary focus of when we call her ever virgin. The primary focus is that from beginning, when she was born, brought to the temple, until the day she died and her body was taken up into heaven, that we celebrate on August 14th, she was dedicated to serving the Lord. And so these women who come out and join in this mourning about the temple, these virgins, are the participants a couple hundred years earlier in that same kind of institution, that same kind of idea. So I make a big note of that here because this is an important place to take, for example, if you're having a discussion with a Protestant who says that all that stuff about Mary being in the temple is bunk, that's not in the Bible. Right? That kind of thing. Right? This is one of the places you could show them, no, there were virgins, right? And there's a particular Greek who lived in the temple, there's a particular Greek word used to describe them. And that's the word that's used to describe the Theotokos.
At which point they would say that Maccabees is
Well, they can, but whether it's in the Bible or not, historically it shows that there were virgins in the temple, right? And in their Bible, this is the word that's used to refer to the Theotokos. So this is an important piece of that. Okay, so everyone is in mourning because this Heliodorus is going to come and he's going to go and he's going to violate the temple by going into it and then seize all of the money that's there. Verse 22, so they called upon the Almighty Lord to keep safe and secure what had been entrusted for those who had placed them in trust. But Heliodorus continued with what had been decided. So when he arrived at the treasury with his bodyguard, the Lord of spirits and all authority was already present. He caused such a great manifestation that all who dared to accompany him were panic-stricken at God's power. They turned about and fled in feebleness and terror. For a certain horse appeared to them, having a fearful rider. It was arrayed with a very beautiful pack saddle, and it rushed furiously at Heliodorus and struck at him with its front hooves. He who sat thereon was seen wearing a full armor of gold. 2 other young men also appeared to him, remarkable in bodily strength, very beautiful in grandeur, and illustrious in dress. They stood on each side of him and pummeled him continually, inflicting him with many wounds. Okay? So they go there, despite all the people's protest, and this miraculous occurrence happens where these men appear, 1 on horseback and 2 on foot, and proceed to beat the tar out of them. Right? And send them packing. Suddenly Heliodorus fell to the ground and a deep darkness overcame him. His men then picked him up and put him on a stretcher and carried him away. This man who had just entered the treasury with a great retinue and all his bodyguard, but now was not able to help himself. So they came to know, and it was clearly proven to be the power of Almighty God. He was speechless because of the divine visitation, being thrown on the ground, deprived of all hope of recovery. The people blessed the Lord, who acted marvelously for his own place. The temple, which a little while earlier had been full of fear and trouble, was now filled with joy and gladness because the Almighty Lord had appeared. Certain friends of Heliodorus quickly entreated Onias the high priest to call upon the Most High to grant life to him who was lying there, about at his last breath. Okay, so now, ironically, they're now hauling him out on a stretcher. He's in bad shape. And so ironically, the rest of his retinue, these Greeks, go to the high priest, Onias, and ask Onias to pray so that Heliodorus will recover. So the high priest, suspecting the king might think some foul play was perpetrated by the Jews regarding Heliodorus, offered sacrifice for his recovery. While the high priest was making the offering of atonement, the same young men appeared to Heliodorus, dressed in the same apparel. They stood and said, "Be very grateful to Onias the high priest, for on his account the Lord has granted you your life. Now since you were punished by heaven, report to all men the majestic power of God." And then having said this, they became invisible. Verse 35, Then Heliodorus offered sacrifice to the Lord and made very great vows to him who had spared his life. So after he gladly received Onias, he returned with his horses to the king. So this Gentile at least realizes something here. He's now seen the power of God, so he turns around and responds by worshiping God. Then he bore testimony to all men about the deeds of the great God which he had seen with his own eyes. When the king asked Heliodorus what kind of man would be suitable to send on another journey to Jerusalem, he replied, "If you have any enemy or plotter against you, send him there. For you will receive him back thoroughly punished if he should escape at all. For truly there is some power of God about that place. For he who has his dwelling in heaven watches over that place and aids it, and destroys those who come to do it harm."
So they sent Simon.
So this was how things turned out concerning Heliodorus and the preservation of the treasury. Now note here how different, here's our first little story, right, from during this time. Notice how different this is from in 1 Maccabees, the way Judas, especially Judas's brothers after he dies, handle things. Right? What would they have done if they heard one of the Greeks was coming to approach the temple? Yeah, or assassinated him, right? they would have sent in a bunch of troops and murdered him, probably right there in the temple. Right? Because that was their whole attitude. Here we have the exact opposite. Right? Nobody had to pick up a weapon. Nobody there harmed him. In fact, after God struck him down, they prayed for him and restored him. And what was the effect? Remember, this is, again, we were talking about, this little story we just had is an example of the good times, right? this was when everything was going as it should. Remember, earlier, as we'd be going through the whole Old Testament, what was the goal? God said, I want you to follow the Torah, follow my teachings, so that the other nations will see you and say, there's something different, right? There's something different going on there. Their God is different, and will be attracted to go and follow. Well, here they're doing what they're supposed to, and what happens? Heliodorus leaves and goes back and says, there's something different going on. Their God's different. So chapter 4, verse 1, we come back to our friend Simon. The previously mentioned Simon, who informed about the money in his homeland, spoke evil things against Onias, claiming it was Onias himself who terrified Heliodorus and created the calamity. Simon dared to say that Onias, the man who was the benefactor of the city, the protector of his fellow countrymen, and a zealot for the laws, plotted the whole matter. But when Simon's hatred progressed to the point that even murders were committed by those he approved, Onias realized the danger of Simon's love of strife, that Apollonius, son of Menestheus, and governor of Coelesyria and Phoenicia, was even intensifying Simon's malice. Okay. So Simon's causing all this trouble, right? And for a while, Onias, high priest, just ignores it. Right? He just ignores it. But then it comes to the point where Simon is getting people killed with the trouble he's stirring up. So we cross this line, right, where he can't ignore it anymore. people are getting killed because of this guy causing trouble and stirring things up. And he's now with the Greek governor, right? And between the two of them, they're just feeding off of each other, right? Things are getting worse and worse. So he went to the king not to accuse his fellow citizens, but to look out for the common good, both public and private. For he saw that without the king's attention, matters could not reach a peaceful settlement, and that Simon would not cease from his fury. When Seleucus died and Antiochus, also called Epiphanes, succeeded to the kingdom, Jason, the brother of Onias, obtained the high priesthood by corruption. So that's pretty straightforward. Okay, so we'd already heard that and knew from First Maccabees that the high priesthood was now a political appointment. Okay, we happened to get a good one with Onias. Right, well now Seleucus is dead, Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes becomes king. He appoints a new high priest, and that high priest got there basically through bribery and other means. He got that office. Verse 8, for through a petition he promised the king 360 talents of silver, and from another source of revenue 80 talents. In addition to this, he promised to pay 150 more if the king gave him permission to establish a gymnasium as a place for training young men and for enrolling the men of Jerusalem as citizens of Antioch. Remember, Antioch is the new capital, right? So he says, I'm going to build a gymnasium. So this isn't just, I'm going to build a rec center, right? I'm going to build this gymnasium. It's going to be sort of an outpost of Greek culture here in backwards Jerusalem, right? And the people there will learn how to be good citizens of the new capital of Antioch. They'll learn how to be good Syrian Greeks. Verse 10, when the king ascended and Jason seized the high priesthood, he at once changed his countrymen over to the Greek way of life. He set aside the royal benefits to the Jews brought about through John, the father of Eupolemus, the ambassador who established friendship and alliance with the Romans. He also renounced and destroyed conformity to the laws and created a new civic life contrary to the customs. For he eagerly founded a gymnasium under the citadel itself and persuaded the most noble of the young men to wear the Greek cap. What's the Greek cap? Okay. The gymnasium, right, gets its name from the Greek word for nudity. Okay, because when athletes went there to exercise and participate in sport, they did it naked. Okay? And one of the interesting things about Greek athletics, we know they started the Olympic Games. They had games all over the place, not just in Olympia. But the Olympic Games being the most famous, is there were no spectators. There were no spectators at Greek games and Greek sport. They didn't have stands. People didn't come and watch. The idea was that everyone who came and participated and who did these things, that their physical efforts were an offering to the gods. The idea was that they could, through the perfection of the human form, through their athletic achievement, impress the gods with their beauty and their skill and their ability. Okay? And so this Greek cap they're referring to is that the Greeks who did foot races, in the nude, would wear the little hat like the Greek god Hermes, with the little feather, the little wing. Greek god Hermes, or Mercury was the Roman name, god of messengers. Okay, in the foot races, they would wear these hats to try to set themselves up as being like the pagan god. So that's what this is referring to. So the idea is that he's drawing these Jewish young men now into the pagan Greek culture. Right? Their whole way of thinking about the world. Not just their religion. It's not just that they're going and sacrificing to Zeus instead of to Yahweh. They're doing that. But also the whole way they're living their lives. Right? The sport, what they're seeing as values now is physical beauty of form and skill in battle and that sort of thing, rather than the virtues that God taught them. that they should pay. So they're being drawn into Greek culture. Verse 13, so there was the fullest expression of Hellenization and the adoption of foreign customs because of the surpassing wickedness of Jason, who was ungodly and not a true high priest. Pretty clear what the author thinks of Jason here. Therefore the priests were no longer eager to serve at the altar, but they despised the temple and neglected the sacrifices. Instead, they hastened to take part in the unlawful proceedings in the wrestling school after the invitation to the discus. Okay? So he's saying, so the priests, even the priests, the Levites, the people who are supposed to be serving in the temple, sort of abandoned it in their daily activities in favor of going and throwing the discus and learning to wrestle, going and participating in all these Greek activities. Because this is culture, don't you know? Right? These Greeks are so much smarter and wiser than us. So much more technologically advanced. They counted the honors of their fathers as nothing, but regarded Greek honors as the best. For this reason, difficult circumstances overtook them, and those whose way of life they admired and wished altogether to assimilate became their enemies and punished them. For to act in an ungodly way against the divine laws is no light thing, but the following events will make this clear. There's a little bit of foreshadowing there. Things aren't going to go well for them.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is this verse saying that because they tried to be like Greeks, that the Greeks said, look, you're really not, you're imitating us? Were they the ones who were punishing us?
Right, that's what it's alluding to, or foreshadowing, is that ironically, the very people who they're trying to be like are going to be the ones who are going to come back and oppress them. Right, the ones who they admire so much are going to be the ones who are now going to inflict punishment on them. Okay. When the quadrennial games were being held at Tyre, and the king was present, the vile Jason sent ambassadors, since they were Antiochian citizens from Jerusalem, to carry 300 silver drachmas for a sacrifice to Hercules. You see the problem there right off the right off the bat. And Tyre, remember we talked about Tyre had been the capital of the Phoenicians. And the Greeks and Romans actually picked up Hercules. Hercules in Greco-Roman mythology actually comes from Baal, the god that they worship, Baal. The stories and myths about him get sort of taken over by the Greeks and the Romans and changed over into Heracles by the Greeks and Hercules by the Romans, which is why Tyre, the old Phoenician city, they still worship Hercules. They just changed the name. It's still the same Baal worship they've been doing for forever before that. Those who carried the money, however, considered it inappropriate and best not to use the money for sacrifice, but to expend it for another purpose. Okay, so the people carrying it aren't all that pious to decide we should give this money to Hercules, not because they're worshiping Yahweh, but just because I can think of better things to do with this money, right? than throw it to Hercules. So this money intended by the sender for the sacrifice to Hercules was by the decision of those who carried it applied to the construction of battleships. When Apollonius, the son of Menesthius, was sent to Egypt to share in the festal proclamation of King Philometor, the King Philometor is from the Ptolemies dynasty in Egypt, so he's the king of Egypt and Africa. And Antiochus learned that Philometor had become hostile to his government, so he was concerned for his own safety. Therefore, after he reached Joppa, he went on to Jerusalem. He was magnificently received by Jason and the city, being ushered in with torches and shouts. Then he encamped in Phoenicia. So, strife is breaking out between the Syrian Greeks and the Egyptian Greeks. And so he comes down to the area around Jerusalem, Antiochus Epiphanes does, and is warmly received. Verse 23, that after a period of 3 years, Jason sent Menelaus, son of the previously mentioned Simon, to carry the money to the king and to complete the records of necessary business. But when he was commended to the king, Menelaus honored him with an appearance of authority and obtained the high priesthood for himself, outbidding Jason by 300 talents of silver. Okay, so our friend Simon his son gets sent as an envoy by Jason, the lousy high priest, to the king in order to make sure everything's okay, and instead he outbids him and gets the high priesthood for himself. After he received the king's orders, although in no way worthy of the high priesthood, he returned carrying the rage and savage cruelty of a tyrant and a wild beast, and having the wrath of a barbarian. Again, pretty clear what the author thinks of Menelaus. Thus Jason, after he undermined his own brother, was undermined by another, and was driven as a fugitive into the land of the Ammonites. So Menelaus took hold of the high priesthood, but he did not pay regularly any of the money promised to the king. Thus when Sostratus, the commander of the citadel, kept demanding payment, since the collection of revenue was his responsibility, the two of them were summoned before the king on this account. Menelaus left his own brother Lysimachus as his court official in the high priesthood, while Sostratus left Crates in charge of his Cyprian troops. Okay, so Menelaus becomes the high priest, decides he doesn't want to pay the king the money he's supposed to pay the king. Right? So the king's official in Jerusalem keeps saying, hey man, you need to pay up. But he doesn't, and so both the king's official and Menelaus the high priest now get summoned back to the king, who wants to know where the money is. Verse 30, while these things were taking place, it came about that the cities of Tarsus and Malus revolted because they were given as a gift to Antiochus, the king's concubine. Okay, so these two cities, Tarsus and Malus, which are actually up in what's now Turkey, okay, they were given to the king's concubine, meaning his female slave, who he slept with, as a gift, probably at a party or something. They didn't like being toyed with that way, and so they revolt against the king. So the king went quickly to put down the rebellion. He left Andronicus, a man highly regarded, to act as his regent. But Menelaus, thinking he had gained a convenient opportunity, pilfered some of the gold vessels from the temple and gave them to Andronicus. As it happened, he had already sold other vessels to Tyre and the neighboring cities. So, king, right, heads up to suppress this revolt. Menelaus thinks, well, that might be a good chance to get some of that money I owe in back taxes. Right? So he grabs a bunch of the gold vessels from the temple and starts selling them off to get money. But when Onias found out exactly what had taken place, he condemned these acts after he departed to a safe place at Daphne, located near Antioch. Therefore Menelaus took Andronicus aside and urged him to kill Onias. Thus Andronicus went to Onias and persuaded him with deceit. He welcomed him with sworn pledges and gave him his right hand, although Onias was suspicious. Andronicus persuaded him to come out of his place of sanctuary. Then, with no sense of justice, he immediately put him to death. For this reason, not only the Jews, but also many of the other nations took offense and were angry at the unjust murder of the man. So when the king returned from the region of Cilicia, the Jews in the city pleaded with him regarding the senseless murder of Onias, and the Greeks also felt the common hatred of the crime. Okay, so even the Greeks see that, this guy was murdered, for nothing, that something needs to be done about it. Therefore Antiochus was grieved at heart and filled with pity, and he wept on account of the decency and good behavior of the deceased. Inflamed with anger, he immediately stripped off the purple robe from Andronicus and tore off his garments. Then he led him around the whole city to that very place where he sinned against Onias, and there he put the blood-stained man to death. Thus the Lord repaid him with the punishment he deserved. Verse 39, when much sacrilegious plunder by Lysimachus took place in the city with the consent of Menelaus, and when the report of this spread abroad, the people gathered together against Lysimachus, because many of the gold vessels had already been carried away. So now the general public gets word that Menelaus and his brother Lysimachus are out there selling off the temple things for money, and now they're angry about it. Thus, since the crowds were stirring and completely filled with wrath, Lysimachus armed about 3,000 men and began an unjust attack. Led by a certain Aranus, a man advanced in years but no less advanced in stupidity. Again, the author of 2 Maccabees isn't vague about what he thinks about these people. So when the Jews became aware of the assault of Lysimachus, some picked up stones and clubs, and others took handfuls of ashes lying about, and threw them in utter confusion at Lysimachus and his men. As a result, they wounded many of them, killed some, and forced them all to flee. Then they killed the temple robber himself near the treasury. Okay, so Lysimachus hears that there's this mob gathering, so he gets the bright idea to go and attack them. They attack the mob gets improvised weapons, and the mob kills his men and ends up killing him. But a judgment concerning this was presented against Menelaus. For when the king arrived at Tyre, 3 men sent by the council of elders presented the case before him. But Menelaus, who was already defeated, promised considerable wealth to Ptolemy, son of Doramenes, if he won over the king. Therefore Ptolemy took the king aside into a certain courtyard, as if to offer him refreshment, and persuaded him to change his mind. For he indeed acquitted Menelaus, the cause of all the evil, but he sentenced to death those unfortunate men who would have been freed uncondemned, even if they pleaded before Scythians. The Scythians, Scythia is where Romania is now, and they were sort of renowned at that time as being the most barbaric people anybody could think of. So the idea is like, even if they brought their case before Scythians, they would have gotten more mercy than they got here. Right? Because what happens is, this riot breaks out, Lysimachus is killed, these people are killed. They send 3 people to the king to say, look, he's been selling off the temple treasures, and through this guy Ptolemy, the king decides, well, I can't have riots going on. I can't have mob justice going on in my cities. And so he executes the elders of the people and lets Menelaus the high priest off the hook. So those who had spoken for the city, the people, and the holy vessels quickly suffered the unjust penalty. For this reason, even the Tyrians were indignant over the crime and provided magnificently for their funeral expenses. But Menelaus, because of the covetousness of those in power, remained in office, increased in malice, and brought about great treachery against his fellow citizens. And I think we're going to leave off there tonight. I went really long last time, so leave off a little shorter tonight. When we come back next time, we're going to start at chapter 5. Chapter 5 is where we get into, again, in a little more detail, the abomination of desolation, when Antiochus comes back into the temple. So you can see, we had this brief moment where things were good, right at the beginning, sort of give us a picture of good. But now, as we remember from 1 Maccabees, things aren't going to be so good. Okay, but there's going to be a lot here in these little stories as we get some more of them. There's going to be a lot that's very important in terms of the New Testament and in terms of our Christian faith now, in terms of some of the theological ideas that are central to our faith now are going to start coming out here and leading into what's in the New Testament. So does anybody have any questions before we go about? Okay, so.
Next week, Father.
Oh yeah, Super Bowl, huh? Oh yeah. So in 2 weeks, when we get back together, we'll pick up at chapter 5. Thank you, everybody.